Hello, happy Wednesday. Welcome to PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series. My name is Caitlin Morose, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. Today, Janet Ng, Ph.D. candidate with the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Alberta, will be presenting about Ferruginous Hawk habitat and nesting ecology in southern Alberta and Saskatchewan. Every month, PCAP asks someone to present either in the form of a webinar or an in-person talk in a Saskatchewan community on anything to do with native prairie conservation or species at risk. On April 2nd, Julie Landry DeBauer with the Alberta Conservation Association will be presenting a webinar about grassland songbirds. This will be at noon, and you can find out more information on the PCAP website. Next week is Prairie's Got the Goods Week. Join us for a week-long webinar series about the ecological goods and services provided by the native prairie grasslands. To register or find out more information about these presentations, please visit the PCAP website, www.pcap-sk.org, and just click on Upcoming Events. I would like to take a moment to note that financial support for today's webinar is provided by our gold sponsors, Crescent Point Energy, TransCanada Corporation, SaskPower, Canada North Environmental Services, and Wildlife Habitat Canada. Our supporting sponsor is Eco-Friendly Sask, as well as Environment and Climate Change Canada. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type into the questions section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation, and we will be happy to answer your questions at the end of the webinar. And a bit about our presenter today. So Janet has expertise in ecological modeling, focusing on landscape ecology, habitat use, reproductive performance, and cumulative effects. Janet received her Bachelor of Science from the University of Alberta, her Master of Science from the University of Regina, and her Doctorate in Philosophy from the University of Alberta. Her Ph.D. work, under the supervision of Dr. Aaron Bain and Dr. Troy Wellicombe, evaluated the cumulative effects of land use and climate change on Ferruginous Hawks habitat use and reproduction. Working with provincial and federal recovery teams, industry stakeholders, landowners, and environmental nonprofits, Janet has used her research results to develop management tools that can be applied to conservation and recovery of Ferruginous hawks in Canada. Janet has worked with a number of wildlife species in different sectors, including environmental nonprofits and environmental consulting. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Janet.
All right, super. Thank you very much for that introduction, Caitlin. Today I'm going to be kind of giving everybody a highlight reel of some of the work that I've done in the last few years studying Ferruginous hawks in southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan. I recently completed my PhD. I defended it in January, and I'm so excited to start sharing some of these results with folks, especially folks that are actually in southern Alberta and Saskatchewan, where a lot of the field work has taken place. Of course, before getting started, I'd like to, oh, there it goes. Certainly acknowledge the great team that I had the very great privilege to work with. The Raptor Ecology and Conservation team, or REACT for short, was headed by Dr. Aaron Bain and by Dr. Troy Wellicombe. We've had and currently have a number of graduate students on board studying different parts of ecology, Ferruginous hawks, and we've also had a postdoc working with us as well too. And it's together that we've been able to tackle a lot of really interesting and important questions about Ferruginous hawk ecology. And of course, there was a huge effort that went into the work, into the research that I'm going to be presenting today. None of it would be possible without the landowners that gave us the access and the privilege of working with their hawks and accessing their land, and just generally sharing their knowledge of the system and of the birds with us as well too. And we are always very, very thankful and grateful for their cooperation. We also had a huge number of staff and volunteers working with us to collect data, a number of student researchers that worked on different tidbits of ecology questions as well too. And we were also very privileged to work with different recovery teams, including the Alberta provincial team and the national recovery team, who helped shape and guide some of the questions that we developed to learn more about Ferruginous Hawks. And so certainly this presentation is to the Prairie Conservation Action Plan and to folks that are generally interested in grassland ecosystems. So I'm kind of preaching to the choir about what land use looks like and what cumulative effects, all these additive, these combined effects might be on the prairies. But to recap it though, because certainly there's some people probably joining us from different parts of the world or who might be less familiar with grassland ecosystems, it's then important to give some background that our grassland systems in the world and certainly in North America have seen a lot of change over the last century. We've lost a lot of natural grass cover to cropland, and this has unfortunately been linked to several population declines of a lot of different types of grassland species, including birds such as songbirds, shorebirds, and raptors as well too. And so we've seen a lot of landscape change through land cover loss or natural land cover loss, but we've also seen a lot more additional industrial infrastructure and human development out on those landscapes as well too. Things such as oil and gas development, but then also we're seeing a lot more renewable energy infrastructure coming onto the landscape as well too. So things such as solar farms or wind farms, infrastructure that's associated with that, such as distribution lines, transmission lines, roads, and so forth. There have been a number of studies that have unfortunately linked some types of industrial infrastructure on the grasslands to negative effects on wildlife. So it can degrade habitat use or even affect reproduction. Some examples include oil and gas development, unfortunately being negatively influencing species interactions such as for mule deer or for pronghorn, which apparently don't like to be around these types of infrastructure. And so it has a negative effect. It can result in a loss of habitat in places that have this new infrastructure. We are also expecting, and we've experienced a lot of climate change in the grassland ecosystem as well too. And so we're seeing not only land cover change, we're seeing added human development and industrial infrastructure on the landscape. We're also experiencing and expecting to see more changes in seasonal weather as well. And so some of those patterns that we're expecting to change and have changed include increased seasonal temperatures into the future, decreased precipitation during the summer, and then also more frequent storms and storms that are greater severity as well too. And so when we add these three different changes and these changing environments to the grasslands, then that means that we've got a lot of different things that are happening at the same time, sometimes overlapping in the same space as well too, and potentially then influencing the wildlife and plants that are on that landscape. I will walk you through a highly sophisticated landscape simulation that I developed in PowerPoint. But just I want to demonstrate what these cumulative effects, all these additive or combined effects across the grassland system could look like. And so if we have a landscape here where the green is natural grass cover, and in southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan, the majority of that grass cover is grazed, we do have some landscapes that have cropland as well too. And so in the last century and continuing on as well too, we have seen more grass covered loss to conversion to cropland. And so we've added a few more orange blocks here to represent a bit more cropland, and therefore also a loss of grassland cover as well. And then we've got a lot of roads. We have a lot of human development across southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan. We have grid roads, range roads that crisscross through the landscape. And then we also have different types of industrial infrastructure, say, for example, oil and gas development that has grown in the last few decades. And that oil and gas development is associated with its own different type or its own kinds of infrastructure as well too. So there's more roads that lead to wells. There's often power lines and pipelines that happen on the landscape as well too. With renewable energy, we're seeing more power line infrastructure happening and coming onto the landscape to be able to connect things such as wind turbines. And so this is a lot of human development or changes to that structural landscape in the prairies. But then also when we add climate change to it, there's a lot of different factors, a lot of different variables that are happening at the same time, and often in the same space as well too. And then understanding what all of these cumulative effects, what these combined effects might mean for wildlife, such as birds, then becomes a challenge. And it's also very relevant because we have changed the landscape. We will need to understand what that change might mean for the wildlife and plants that live out there. And so Ferruginous hawks are a type of soaring hawk, and so a raptor that's found in parts of North America. They are North America's largest Buteo species, so largest soaring hawk. They're found throughout different open areas in North America, including the Great Plains, and also down into the States as well too, into other open areas. And they come up to northern United States and into southern Alberta, Saskatchewan, and a little bit into Manitoba for the breeding season. And then they migrate down to southern United States and northern Mexico to spend their winters. And they're a very, very cool bird. So females, they can be up to 2 kilograms, and their wingspans can be almost 5 feet, which is about as wide as I am tall. And so they're a pretty big beast to work with. Really beautiful, very interesting species. They often nest in trees. They'll often nest on cliff sides or hoodoos or on rock piles as well too. And there are ground nests, and historically more Ferruginous hawks were ground nesters before there were trees planted onto the landscape. So this is a neat photo that was given to us by Amy Nixon. And this nest was actually from I think in the early 1900s, taken outside of the Maple Creek area. And so you can see there's no trees in the background, and these birds have nested on the ground. So it's a really neat historical difference of where birds are nesting then and then compared to now as well too. Unfortunately, Ferruginous hawks are listed as a species at risk, so they're a threatened species at the federal under the Species at Risk Act, and then they're an endangered species in Alberta under their Endangered Species Act. They've unfortunately experienced a pretty big population decline. They've dropped quite a bit since about the 1990s and have somewhat stabilized, but at much lower population levels. And also their range has contracted by almost half, and so where they were found in over more areas in Alberta and Saskatchewan, now they're restricted to a much smaller range throughout the two provinces and a very small corner in Manitoba. There's a lot of ideas and hypotheses as to why they might have experienced this decline, range contraction, and some of those threats might include loss of grassland cover. Ferruginous hawks have long been thought to be really strongly tied to grassland, like large contiguous tracts of grassland, and so therefore if we see loss of that grassland cover, say for example conversion to cropland, that might negatively affect Ferruginous hawks. Ferruginous hawks are also very closely tied to their food source, which is ground squirrels. A number of previous studies have shown that when ground squirrels populations are really high, then Ferruginous hawks tends to do really well in terms of survival and producing babies as well. And then same thing when ground squirrels tank, then Ferruginous hawks unfortunately seem to go down as well too. So changes to food availability or that prey availability might be affecting the population. Unfortunately, Ferruginous hawks are sort of a big raptor, and they still experience persecution, and so they still get occasionally shot simply for being a predator or simply for being a target. Ferruginous hawks are also at risk of electrocution as well too, depending on where they perch and what type of structure they're perching on. And then one of the increasing types of conflict that we're seeing is wind energy conflict, because unfortunately sometimes Ferruginous hawks do exist, or they migrate through areas that are windy, that have wind development. And so unfortunately there is potential for wind energy conflict, and there have been some observations of birds being injured or killed after a turbine strike. And then Ferruginous hawks have long been considered very sensitive to human disturbance. And so as we build more things on the landscape, as we have more human activity on the landscape, then there is some hypotheses, there are ideas that maybe they have been negatively influenced by simply our presence and our activity out on the landscape as well too. A lot of these ideas about being sensitive to human disturbance, they originated from a study that was done in the early 1980s. The fieldwork was done in pretty early May, so pretty early in the nesting season for Ferruginous hawks. And generally when they're somewhat sensitive as well too, much like most species would early in the nesting cycle. And what these researchers did is that they exposed nests to different types of disturbance, to human activity. So they walked up to nests on foot, they drove up to nests in vehicles, and they also exposed nests to different types of noise, so this type of human disturbance. Some of it was chronic, so they had small engines, such as, like, for example, maybe lawnmower type engines nearby. But then they also exposed nests to intermittent noise disturbance as well too. So for example, they approached the nest on foot, walking up to it while shooting a rifle into the air. And so as you can imagine, that's a pretty dramatic type of disturbance. And what they observed were birds flushing off the nest, and also in some cases too, birds unfortunately abandoning their nests. And so they documented a pretty strong and immediate behavioral response by these birds that they exposed to these treatments. And that's led to a belief that this is common across the population. But also this is a pretty specific study, and it was also done in a pretty dramatic fashion. And so then trying to learn more about the sensitivity to human disturbance is going to be pretty important to understanding what it means to be a Ferruginous hawk living in a landscape such as southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan, where there's people and land use and things happening. There's a lot of mixed anecdotal reports, though. I mean, there are birds that do nest in the middle of nowhere that aren't exposed to a lot of people or vehicle traffic. But then there's also nests that often occur on human structures, like this one that's sitting on a shack associated with a gas well, and they nested there every year and did pretty well. And then one of my favorite nests was one that we found in 2013 that was brand new. And this is actually the corner of Junction Highway 21 and Highway 1. So this is Highway 1 going across through here, which gets about 5,000 to 7,000 cars a day. And then Highway 21 goes north and south and gets about 1,000 to 2,000 vehicles a day. And this nest was actually located in this tree right here. And this bird decided to take over an old nest that maybe, I don't know, a crow or somebody else had previously built. And actually, when we found it, there was a front end loader scraping a new parking lot directly beneath it while the female was incubating above. And so we have a lot of these mixed anecdotes and then also mixed results from different scientific studies as well too. And so we're trying to understand, what does it mean for Ferruginous hawk to live in these landscapes? Are these the exceptions? Are these the norms? What are birds doing, and how well do they do there? And so the bulk of my PhD research was focused on trying to understand how landscape characteristics and different climate variables, such as long-term climate patterns or seasonal weather, can influence habitat use, reproduction, and also food, so through prey deliveries to nests, and how might these landscape characteristics and climate then influence these three very important ecological components of Ferruginous hawks. And then, because they are a species at risk, we were interested in making sure that our results from our study were applicable and useful for, say, management recommendations for the conservation and recovery of Ferruginous hawks. So as I mentioned before, the work took place down in southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan. These lands are included or covered under Treaties 2, 4, 6, and 7. And we're very fortunate to be able to do the work here across southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan. The green here represents native grassland, and the white represents generally cropland. And so you can see throughout Alberta and Saskatchewan, there are some areas that have quite a bit of grassland, and then areas that are quite dominated by cropland, and then areas that have a little bit of a mix of the two that are more heterogeneous and kind of give us a gradient from high grass all the way to areas that have very little grass as well too. And then same thing across that study area, we have different types of industrial infrastructure across different intensities as well. So these dark green dots here represent oil wells, or active oil wells, and the orange dots represent gas wells. And so you can see that they have somewhat of a clustered arrangement across the study area, but then areas that have both, and then areas that have a little bit of each as well too. And this gives us a nice experimental design, or a nice design to be able to monitor and study nests across these different land cover types and across this different infrastructure as well too. So we structured our research to monitor nests to understand what the influence of land cover and industrial infrastructure would mean for habitat selection and reproduction. So this means that we surveyed and we monitored nests in areas that had lots of grassland and very low industrial infrastructure, so very little of it. But then we also surveyed and monitored nests that had a little bit of industrial infrastructure to areas that were in grassland that have lots of industrial infrastructure. So in this case, this landscape here has a lot of well wells around throughout the landscape. And then because we're interested in land cover, then we also surveyed and monitored for nests in areas that had very little cropland, to some that had some cropland, so sort of a more mosaic, heterogeneous landscape, and then areas that are dominated by cropland as well too. And then because we're interested in cumulative effects, so what are the combined effects of these different human activities or human development, we also surveyed and monitored for nests that were in landscapes dominated by cropland with very little industrial infrastructure, and then again across landscapes that had a little bit more and more different types of industrial infrastructure and different intensities of it as well too. So then if textbook hypotheses, if we were to make predictions about where birds would be found, we would expect the most birds to be found in areas that look very pristine and very natural, with lots of grassland cover And if they were sensitive to human disturbance, again, areas that have very low human development or activity in them. So these nice big, large, contiguous tracts of grassland. We would expect to find most birds there. And then two, if they were sensitive to human disturbance and their survival or reproduction was negatively influenced by things such as industry or land cover, cropland cover, then we would also expect their reproduction to be highest in these areas with lots of grassland and low human infrastructure, and then lowest in nests that are located in landscapes with lots of cropland and lots of industrial infrastructure. And so we covered a lot of southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan, and we looked for nests in all of these places and then monitored them throughout the season for a number of years. And so the first bit that I'm going to be talking about is about what might predict where birds select their home ranges. So where might they place their real estate, or what might be hot real estate if you were a Ferruginous hawk? So where would you put your home range? So the work was done in southern Alberta and southern Saskatchewan, and for this analysis, I actually used a historical data set that included over 2,000 nests that were found between 2005 and 2010. And essentially, I used the GIS, and so I used spatial data, and I quantified what that landscape around each of those nests looked like within 2.5 kilometer radius. And so 2.5 kilometer radius is about core home range for a Ferruginous hawk. And so it's essentially where birds spend most of their time around their nest. And so I described those landscapes around their nests by geography. So where in the study area are they located? Are they on the northern edge or in the core? And then I looked at different land cover variables. So how much grass was around that nest? How much edge was around that nest? And I quantified edge by looking at where grassland and cropland would meet, so kind of where they interface, and then also the edges of water bodies and wetlands, and then roads as well too. And so I used these to describe the amount of edge that surrounded each nest. I quantified how much industrial development were around each nest, so say how many oil wells or gas wells, transmission distance to transmission lines, and so forth. At the time of the study, the wind farms were only located in a few spots, and so I wasn't able to include wind turbines into this analysis of industrial development, and that would be sort of the next step of study for somebody that'd be interested in that. I also looked at a number of different climate and soil characteristic variables that could potentially predict where these birds are found. And what I found was that there are actually a number of different types of variables that predict where birds select home ranges. And I did find a couple of landscape variables, land cover variables that predicted where they were found. Interestingly, they were most likely to be found in areas that had about half grassland and half cropland around those nests. And they were also more likely to be setting up home ranges in places that had a moderate amount of edge, and also if they were closer to water. I also found a couple of industrial infrastructure variables that could predict where birds put home ranges. Home ranges were more likely to be near to active oil wells, and then also in areas that have slightly higher oil and gas road density as well too. Then some of the climate and soil characteristics that I tested could also predict where these birds were found. And so from all of these different variables that predicted home range selection, I was able to put them into a map, and essentially I quantified what that landscape looked like in the study area, and I applied my habitat models to it. And this gives us a predictive model of where home ranges are more likely and less likely to be selected for Ferruginous hawks. So areas that are dark, we're more likely to find Ferruginous hawk home ranges and nests, and areas that are light, where we expect we don't expect as many home ranges to be, or we're less likely for home ranges to be selected in those areas. And this predictive map gives us a lot of different management tools as well too, which I'll talk about later as well too. But it's kind of a nice first look at where birds are more likely to be found. But if we only looked at where birds were found, and we didn't also look at things like such as survival or reproduction, we only get one snapshot view of what birds are doing. And to be able to understand habitat quality, so understanding where they live and what are the consequences of on reproductive success, putting those things together gives us a much clearer picture of habitat quality and gives us a lot more information if we were then working towards conservation recovery for the species at risk. So linking habitat selection and reproduction is then really critical, especially for the species at risk. And so what I did here was I developed another habitat model, but I predicted how many nests were expected onto a landscape. And then I also looked at whether there were variables that could predict reproductive success for Ferruginous hawks. And so are there consequences to their selection of habitat, and what are those consequences on reproduction? Because then we can make conclusions about, from there we can make conclusions onto the population as well too, and again, conservation and recovery of the species. He did a lot of surveying for Ferruginous hawks across the study area. And essentially what I did is I used that same design where we surveyed for nests in areas that had lots of grassland, but very little industrial development, to areas that had lots of grassland and lots of industrial development, and then so forth, increasing amounts of cropland as well too, and then those combined landscapes where we had both cropland and industrial infrastructure. We did over 200 driving surveys across these township-sized blocks across both provinces, and I looked at a suite of variables that were very similar to that previous model. So I looked at geography of where these birds might be found throughout the study area. I looked at different line cover variables, such as the amount of grassland within those townships and the edge density, and then also similar industrial development metrics and climate and soil as well too. And so what I found was that, again, there are land cover variables that can predict relative nest abundance of ferruginous hawks. So in a township, if a township has a moderate amount of grass, so about half grass and half crop, we would expect the highest number of nests to be located there. Same thing with edge density. So about a moderate amount of edge density then predicted the highest number of nests. And so because we can quantify how much grass and edge are in each of these townships throughout the study area, and again, I was able to apply that model to then predict how many nests, approximately how many nests we would find in the study area. So dark green were areas that had the highest abundance, medium abundance, and medium green, and then the light yellow we would expect 0 or very few ferruginous hawk nests. And again, this gives us a lot of information about that might be useful for prioritizing landscapes and for management for the species. So from there, I then tackled reproductive performance. So how well were these birds doing nesting-wise? We subsampled, and so we monitored some nests that we found each year, and we monitored them once a week. And we essentially counted how many eggs and how many young were in the nest, how long they survived, and if they were able to fledge young once they were old enough. And so I looked at nest survival, and nest survival is how likely a nest was able to live long enough to fledge at least one young. And then I also looked at clutch size, which is the number of eggs laid, and then fledge rate, which is the number of young that naturally leave the nest when they're of age, which is about 40 to 50 days old. We monitored a lot of nests between 2010 and 2015. We checked on them, and we collected a huge amount of data that went into this, using, again, that stratified design, comparing nests in different types of landscapes with different land cover amounts and industrial development intensities. And so we found that there were some land cover and some industrial development variables that could predict where birds were going to do well and where they might not do as well. On the y-axis is probability of nest survival, so how likely were these nests going to survive to fledging one young. And we found that with oil well density, for nests located in areas that had very few oil wells or some oil wells, they tended to have higher nest survival probability than nests that were located in oil fields with a lot of oil wells. And what's interesting is that this pattern was not the same for gas wells either. And so gas wells, they relatively had about the same probability of nest survival, no matter how many gas wells surrounded each nest. We also found that there were some seasonal weather variables that could predict nest survival. And so here with nest survival on the y-axis and average winter temperature of the season previous on the x-axis here, we find that we predict that nest survival is likely to be highest after a really cold winter, or a colder winter. And this is kind of neat, because I think this is more of a testament. This tells us that winters probably affect things such as food. Because Ferruginous hawks, they're not here in the winter, they're down south where it's nice and warm, but something is affecting their nest survival, and it's likely food, because ground squirrels tend to do better after a cold winter as well too. That insulative layer that's nice and stable and even throughout the winter, ground squirrels tend to do better, which probably means there's more food that's upcoming breeding season, more food to be able to feed Ferruginous hawks. We also still found some similar land cover variables that can predict nest survival as well too. And so areas that had a little bit more grassland tend to do a little bit more poor for nest survival compared to areas that have less grass. And then we also found that nest survival was, again, highest in areas that have that moderate amount of edge density. And so taking these land cover variables, taking those industrial variables, and also and essentially applying that model again to the study area, we were able to predict where birds are most likely to have high survival and where birds were more likely to do poorly. And so what's kind of neat is that these very light yellow brown areas here, they actually represent some of the oil fields that are in different parts of the study area. And because these areas have high densities of oil wells, we would predict then nest survival for Ferruginous hawks to be lower in those areas. So we've looked at habitat selection, we've looked at reproductive success. So then what might be the reason why these patterns are affecting habitat selection and reproduction? And so, as I mentioned earlier, Ferruginous hawks are really tied to their stomachs. They are all about ground squirrels. And so then understanding that linkage between habitat quality, so selection and reproduction, and what that means for food then can be really important, especially if we're trying to understand more about how landscapes and food can influence the population. And so this part of the study, we put out some digital video cameras out at nests. This again was a really Herculean amount of work and effort that went into it. And we collected over and watched over 320 days of footage across over 80 nests using an army of staff, volunteers, and students that collected this data. And we found some really neat things with it. And so here's a quick video of a Ferruginous hawk delivering fast food delivery of the ground squirrel back to the nest. And so we did find, as we expected, that ground squirrels made up a really large part of their diet. Over 84% of all the deliveries that came to the nest were rich in ground squirrels. When we looked at how much mass or how much biomass was being brought in, those ground squirrels made up over 90% of how much food was coming into the nest. And so when we looked at prey delivery rates, so brood provisioning overall, we found some landscape characteristics and seasonal weather variables that could predict this brood provisioning. And again, it's not necessarily things that are affecting directly Ferruginous hawks, but we suspect that some of these variables are actually influencing ground squirrel and other prey ecology that's then influencing brood provisioning for Ferruginous hawks. So with prey delivery on the y-axis and the number of active oil wells around the nest on the x-axis, nests that were located in areas that had a lot of oil wells tended to have fewer prey delivery items delivered back to the nest. And so that might mean that maybe Ferruginous hawks are spending more time being vigilant in these areas that have more human activity, or maybe there are just fewer ground squirrels. And so there might be a couple of different reasons why that pattern is there. But we can predict how much food is brought in by oil well density around the nest. We also found that some of the seasonal weather variables could predict prey delivery back to nests. This is a bit of a complicated graph, and we could talk about it for a long time. So I'm just going to pull out a couple of key points that I want to point out. So again, prey delivery is on the y-axis, and the amount of grassland is on the x-axis. And what's neat is that in cooler springs, it doesn't matter how much grass is surrounding that nest, prey deliveries are generally pretty high and pretty stable across, no matter how much land cover is different across those around those nests. However, when springs are warmer, nests that are located in areas that have more grassland tended to have higher prey delivery rates compared to nests in warm springs with less grassland and likely generally more cropland. And so cooler springs here tend to predict more food going back to those nests, independent of how much grass is there. And so there's essentially a whole Ph.D. that people could do trying to understand ground squirrel ecology, how the landscape and how seasonal weather can influence food and what that means for Ferruginous hawks. So there's a lot more to dig into there, and it's all super interesting. But essentially, we found some patterns that could predict food delivery back to these nests, and they're important because then we've identified a few things that we need to learn more about. So how does this influence prey? How does that then influence Ferruginous hawks? And things like even understanding where these birds are hunting and where they're actually catching prey. Those are the next steps of some of the research that we need to do to understand these patterns better. So we covered a lot of ground about habitat models and reproduction models. And so to get into more of the nitty-gritty or some of the more practical applications, then how can we apply some of the results from our study into actually on-the-ground management or into higher level conservation recovery actions for these birds as well too. And so that's always been sort of a key thing that we've wanted to do, is making sure that our results, our research is useful at the end of the day. And so we studied a lot of nests that were located on platforms and on trees. And what we found was that nests that are in trees were a lot more likely to blow out than nests on platforms. And so whether there were big windstorms or rainstorms that blew out nests that actually had eggs or young in them, or also nests in trees would blow out over the winter as well too, and not be there come spring when birds are returning back to breed. And so we found that platforms actually, nests located on platforms did very, very well compared to nests in trees, most likely because they're a more stable structure that aren't going to get blown over. And so platforms can be used, so what we've concluded is that platforms can be very useful for replacing a fallen or damaged nest. And so if a nest has come out of a tree, or the tree has come down, whether from weather or from cattle damage occasionally as well too, then replacing that with a platform can be really good, because it's essentially replacing a nest that the Ferruginous hawk was already using, and it can be good then for future reproductive efforts. There's a lot of farmers and ranchers that are very interested in putting nest platforms up, and what we found with some of our food delivery work using the video cameras, and this supports the work done by Joe Schmutz a few years ago, a Ferruginous hawk family can bring back over 500 ground squirrels in a season. And so having hawks around is a really great thing. So if they're there naturally in trees, that's super. Let's say that nest falls over and you want to keep them around, replacing with a platform can be really good for everybody. Some of the work that's done by ACA and Multisar out of Alberta have shown that adding a couple of, when fighting adults or fighting males in the spring are observed in an area, putting up a new platform sort of close by can be good to provide more nest structures for them to nest in, and that can potentially then reduce competition for birds. We've also seen platforms be used to relocate risky nests. So every so often we do hear about or observe a nest in a place that's not great for Ferruginous hawks. And so, for example, on top of a power line or on top of a risky power pole. And so we have seen platforms used successfully to then move birds off after the breeding season. And so then they're more likely to return back to their nest on the platform than back onto the power pole. And that can be, again, helpful because this bird is a species at risk, and we want to then reduce risk for them. We've seen platforms be used as well too when people and companies are interested in providing offsets for them. And so some of the work that we're doing, so for example, these habitat selection models, having those predictive maps of where we're more likely to find hawks can then be used to actually make some informed decisions about where to put the next platform. So replacing a nest if it's damaged is one thing, that's a very specific individual instance, but as an offset, people are interested in knowing where they can have the most bang for their buck for conservation for the species. And using a predictive model where to put platforms can then be useful. If people are interested in platform work, there's some guidelines that are available online from the Alberta Environment and Parks folks, and then also guidelines put out by Alberta Conservation Association. One of the things that we do want to stress, though, is that platforms, they're often considered sort of a go-to tool, but they really need to be thoughtfully used. Again, using sort of science-driven management techniques. So where should we put a nest? Does it make sense to put a nest here? And what does it mean for future hawks if we were to put a nest up? All of these things need to be pretty carefully considered. The other kind of really neat thing that we found out of this research, that we found common themes across these different types of analyses. So we found in habitat selection, reproduction, and how much food was being brought back to nests, nests that were in mosaic or heterogeneous landscapes that have some grass, some crop, and some edge, tended to have they were more likely to put home ranges and nests in landscapes that looked like that. And then there were also, the reproduction was predicted to be highest. And also they brought back the most food in these types of landscapes as well too. And so one of the things that conservation or landscape managers often have to discuss is how to go about what's the best plan of attack for management, conservation, and even restoration of these natural grasslands. And so there's one way to go about it is looking at trying to keep those large intact contiguous grassland chunks together, which is still very important for the species that need that. But then from a restoration point of view, do we make those large patches of grassland larger, or do we work on saving or restoring these smaller postage stamps, these smaller patches of prairie that are away from these large patches? And because Ferruginous hawks tend to select habitat and tend to do better reproductively in these heterogeneous landscapes, This gives us a lot of science-backed results that they're going to do better in areas that have these heterogeneous landscapes. And so if I were to recommend restoration, I would be recommending restoring and maintaining and or restoring landscapes that are also heterogeneous, because that gives us the ability to conserve and help species that require those large tracts of grassland, that like to have big things that are nearby that'll benefit it, but they won't always benefit Ferruginous hawks quite the same way unless we add some of these more chunky or patches of grassland, say connect them to the larger ones or just have them nearby as well too. This can benefit Ferruginous hawks and species that require those large tracts of grassland. From an industrial management point of view, then we found that there was a couple of variables that predicted habitat selection and reproductive success. And so we found that nests that were located in areas that had high density of oil wells tended to be poorly reproductively. And so our recommendation would be to then avoid having these high densities of oil wells. And then also from a reclamation and restoration point of view as well too, we don't necessarily understand the mechanism as to why they do not as well nesting wise in these high density oil fields, but potentially reclaiming some of these high density oil wells and reducing that density or reducing the number of oil wells in those landscapes could potentially be beneficial for Ferruginous hawks. It would certainly be good for the landscape because we would be reducing these human structures out there, but it could also benefit Ferruginous hawks as well too. So some of the work, the habitat models and the reproduction models that I developed over the last few years, they've been used to identify important hawk habitat for different jurisdictions. And we've also just learned a lot about what might be affecting Ferruginous hawks and what might be affecting their populations in Canada. And from these different types of models and the different work that we've done, we've developed some of these evidence-driven tools that can be useful for conservation recovery for the species at risk. And these things include applying some of the models that we've developed. And so, as I mentioned before, wind power is growing very quickly. I know Saskatchewan has wind power goals to increase by 30% in the next decade. Unfortunately, wind power doesn't always get along with wildlife, and so it has been shown to have negative influence on bat populations and then also raptor populations as well too. And there's a lot of added infrastructure associated with wind. And so what I did was I overlaid that home range habitat selection model, so where birds are more likely to be found, and I actually overlaid it with a wind potential map that's freely available by the Government of Canada. And I looked at where areas that were very windy and also had a lot of hawks. And so if they're very windy and have a lot of hawks, then that risk is likely higher for hawks living there because maybe wind companies are interested in developing there. So these are high conflict areas that should probably be avoided because we expect to have a lot of hawks and therefore expect conflict. And then relatedly, we also identified, as I overlaid these two maps together, we were able to identify areas that were very, very windy, but probably had low probability of finding hawks there. So we weren't expecting to find hawks. And so these might be good areas for wind companies to focus on because they're windy, but the liability of conflict with the species at risk is likely to be lower. So these might be areas that could be prioritized for development. And then also we're interested in areas to conserve into the future as well too. And so I identified areas that were not very windy, but were really great for hawks. And so these areas might be good for prioritizing, say, conservation easements, then also maybe or setting some aside or putting some protections around them as offsets, essentially because they have high conservation value. We don't expect conflict with wind energy because they're not very windy, but they're pretty great for hawks, so they might be important to set aside. And then because I also looked at how birds did reproductively, so nest success-wise across these landscapes, I was able to then overlay a couple more models where I looked at where birds were expected to be most abundant, so where the landscapes with most nests, and how they did reproductively. So in primary habitats and secondary habitats, we expected birds to be there up to higher abundances, and the reproduction to be pretty good based on what that landscape looks like. And that's great. So those might be important areas to conserve and to maintain. But then I was also able to identify areas where maybe there were expected to be nests, so medium to high abundance, but unfortunately that reproductive success was predicted to be lower or moderate. And so these are areas that are of high concern or moderate concern that might then need some intervention, some management, some stewardship, some direct management to then increase or at least manage those factors that might be influencing your reproduction. Because right now, birds are choosing to nest there, but when they nest there, the reproduction is unfortunately lower. And then, of course, we also identified areas that were probably low concern. So we don't really expect to see a lot of birds out there, so then it's okay no matter how well we do. And so that's areas that don't need as much attention or priority. And again, we can map it all out. We can see in the green areas, these are areas that are pretty good. These are areas where we expect birds to nest, and we would expect them to do pretty well. And then these yellow and these brown townships, we expect birds to be there, but the reproduction might be lower. And so this is where management or intervention could be prioritized, and can be actually used very strategically as sort of an overused word, but it's true. We can actually target these areas and go in and do something to improve nesting success for Ferruginous hawks. So if there's any kind of take home from this, I really want people to appreciate how much rigor and how much data went into this to really show that Ferruginous hawks, yes, they need grassland, but they're also more likely to be found and to do well reproductively in areas that are in landscapes that are heterogeneous, that have some grass, some cropland, and some edge. And then also too, we found some climate variables, climate patterns, and seasonal weather patterns that could also predict where birds are found and how well they did there. And that means that any future conservation and recovery plans need to consider climate change into that trajectory, into those actions as well too, because we do expect climate change to have an impact, and therefore it needs to be taken into consideration. And so with that, a huge thank you to the many supporters that supported us throughout this work, that allowed us to collect the data and do the work. And we're very, very grateful for the contributions as well too. And then from there, if anybody has any questions, I am happy to answer them if we have time.
Thank you so much, Janet. That was an awesome presentation. It's really incredible the amount of work that you've shown us today. So on behalf of our listeners, thank you so much for taking the time to show this. To all of our listeners out there, thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, please feel free to type it into the question section on the webinar dashboard. Janet, one of our listeners would like to know how long you've been working on this project for, like how many years?
Ooh, a number of years. So I started on in 2010 as a project manager, and then took it over as a graduate student. And then we've had a couple of different cohorts of graduate students that have gone through it as well too. But the project started in 2010.
Wow, that's awesome. One of our listeners, Jeff, says, thank you, Janet. Well done. A listener named Jarrett is wondering, were you able to get a sense of adult mortality during the nesting season?
That's a great question. So we have a sense for, yes, adult survival, because as part of our project, we also had students. Jesse Watson had a huge hand in this. This was mostly his responsibility, but we put a lot of satellite transmitters onto birds. And so we tagged over 50 adult Ferruginous hawks, and actually over 100 post-fledgling Ferruginous hawks as well, with radio transmitters to learn more about juvenile survival and adult survival. And so I crunched these numbers in the last year, and I believe adult survival from over 12 months, so not just during the breeding season, but breeding season, so essentially like July to the next July, so over a year, was about 85%, 85 to 87%. We unfortunately did lose a few birds to different things that we would say negatively affected them when they died. I mean, we had one bird that was confirmed to be electrocuted down on the wintering grounds. We had at least one hit by a car. And I think this is such a critical example too. The one that was hit by a car was brought in by a member of the public and took it to a vet. And the vet unfortunately couldn't do anything to help with the injuries. But I thought they have foresight, and so they actually x-rayed this bird. And they actually had found that this bird had been shot probably with a BB gun or something like that, or maybe just caught the tail end of a shotgun blast, I don't know. But it had even been previously shot in its life before it eventually got hit by a car during the winter, I think on migration actually. And so there are a lot of human activities that directly affect adult survival and of course juvenile survival of Ferruginous hawks. And so to only say that it's landscape or climate that's affecting the population would be an underestimate. We absolutely have a direct impact on them too.
Wow, thank you for that answer. A listener named Alain would like to know if you have a sense on how much of the Ferruginous Hawk were using man-made structures like power poles to be able to support their hunting and guarding during the nest rearing season.
That's a really tricky question that I can't really answer, because in some parts of the study area there were a lot of platforms, and then other parts of the study area there were 0 platforms, and so it's hard to know what percentage of the population is on a human structure. Generally in areas that are good for Ferruginous hawks, so as I mentioned, sort of those heterogeneous landscapes, if there's not a lot of trees around, we found that they were more likely to use human structures. And so whether that was intentional, like a nest platform, or unintentional, like an old farm building or oil and gas infrastructure, like a tank or something like that as well too. Yeah, does that answer your question? Not really, but best I can do.
I think so. Elaine, if you're still there, if you want to write in, if you want like more information, just let us know. We have a question from a listener named Eugene, and he's wondering if, there's lots of questions coming in, which is awesome. Sorry, Eugene is wondering if human development does not increase the food sources, such as like roe dishes, example, are increasing ground squirrels.
Yeah, it's very possible. So one of the neat things that we found was that a moderate amount of veg could predict how much food was brought back into the nest. And so what we don't know is whether or not that means there's sort of ground habitat that's good for ground squirrels. So say they like the short grass, which we predict that they do like, or if it's because they're sitting up on the roads and so they're a little bit more exposed. It's hard to parse out or try to disentangle why these patterns are predicting things like food capture, because then same thing with roads, and also where cropland fields meet pastures, grassland as well too. There's a lot of fence lines associated with both of those. And so one of the ways that Ferruginous hawks hunt is that they like to sit and they just like to keep an eye on things and see what ground squirrels are doing. And so they like to be able to sit and then they fly in to ambush prey. And so we don't know whether edge habitat is good for ground squirrel populations or if it's good for hunting hawks, because then they can make use of perches. And that's actually some of the work that some students are working on right now. And so hopefully we'll be able to untangle that a little bit more in a year or two. That's a great question, though. It's really tricky when we just have these broad patterns that we're trying to understand why they predict these patterns.
Thanks, Janet. A listener named Darcy is wondering if there are any results around indirect poisoning by control of ground squirrels. Have you come across anything like that?
And so we didn't encounter any of that directly. If we recovered any carcasses, whether they were juveniles or adults, we would take them into the different vet colleges for necropsy. We didn't identify any of the birds that we recovered as death caused by poisoning. It very likely does happen though, and they've documented it into the States. And strychnine is a pretty powerful poison that affects their main food source, which is in ground squirrels. So we would expect that to have some sort of influence on Ferruginous hawks that would eat them.
Thank you. A listener named Jarrett would like to know if you know if and or when critical habitat for Ferruginous hawks will be identified by Environment and Climate Change Canada.
I wouldn't know that answer, unfortunately.
Okay, no problem. Jared is also with SaskPower, and he has mentioned that if anyone has any sightings of raptor nests on power lines, to contact him, and I will just share his contact information with everyone there. So this season coming up, if you see any raptor nests, please feel free to contact Jared at SaskPower. So thank you, Jared, for sharing that. We have a few other questions. A listener named Sheena says, thank you for the presentation. And she would like to know, what is the definition of an area with high density oil development? For example, how many wells would be in that given area of land?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I'd have to dig into my writing to pull that out, but I believe it would be over, actually no, I do know. It would be over 25 wells within a radius of 2.5 kilometers of the nest. And so that does work out to be something like 1 point something wells per squared kilometer. Well, actually no, I take that back. I'd have to work out the math, but it's over 25 surrounding that nest. And so in areas that around the Tide Lake Brooks area would be a good representative of high density oil. Areas that are near north of Kindersley as well too, and then a couple of the fields that are in the Shaunavon area are pretty textbook for what we would consider high density oil wells.
Thank you. Listener named Lisa is just wondering if you have surveyed the coulee in the immediate vicinity of Drumheller, or can you comment on whether Ferruginous hawks would nest in coulees that are quite smooth or rounded with few level areas to nest on?
So I don't think we might have had a couple of survey blocks in that area. I've spent quite a bit of time down there because it's beautiful. And so certainly down in the States, Ferruginous hawks are very commonly found on hoodoos, on cliff sides, those eroded banks on the side of coulees as well too. And I have seen an old Ferruginous hawk, or maybe it's still active, I'm not sure. That's actually up on the sort of upland part of a coulee before, actually around the Val-Marie area. And so they weren't necessarily in the coulee, but it was just right on top on the ground actually. And so in a relative sense, it's high up because it's beside an open coulee, but it's still on the ground and sort of like flat open landscape. And so they do nest on the ground, and they don't need a large platform to nest on either. I've seen cliffside nests and tree nests be barely big enough to have a female sort of sitting down low incubating eggs, and so they don't really need a huge amount of space to be able to nest. And so it's very possible that there are Ferruginous hawks nesting in that area, and I hope so. That's a really, really nice area to be.
Awesome. Thanks for that answer. Listener named Cameron would like to know, will the map data showing the windy areas versus potential hawk presence be made available to industry, or is there somewhere that map can be obtained from?
Yeah, so our first step is to publish that map, although it is published in my thesis now, and so and we have shared it with groups in the past. And so if that's something that you're interested, please email me. I think my email is still on the screen right now, and we can do our best to share it with you.
Yes, your email is still on there. And the last question we have right now is a listener named Jana, and she's wondering if you have a photo of the difference between a male and female hawk. And she's also wondering if both parents would bring food back to the nest. If one parent dies during the nesting season, does the nest success rate decrease?
Okay, that's a great question.
Yeah.
Okay, so Ferruginous hawk, male and female, they unfortunately look almost alike, except the females can be 15 to 30% bigger than the males, which is really hard to see unless they're sitting directly beside each other. If they're sitting beside each other, then it's pretty easy to tell who the bigger one is, and the bigger one is the female. In flight, even I don't really trust myself until I've monitored nests for a couple of weeks and seen a lot of birds. The males tend to be a little bit more slimmer. They're kind of meant to be more agile, more fighter jet wise, so they can hunt for food. And the females tend to have a bit more of a broader chest on them. Partly that's just kind of where their weight is. And so, but even then, I need a good look at a bird before I confidently ID them as male or female. In terms of who brings food back to the nest, that's a great question. So when the nestlings are very, very young, so, less than 2 weeks, less than 3 weeks old, it's going to be the male that's doing almost all of the prey delivery. So he's doing the hunting, and he drops it off to the female, and the female strips the meat to feed to the young. And so the male's doing most of the hunting, female's doing the feeding. And then as the young get older, they're a little bit more independent. They can thermally regulate. They don't need somebody to keep them warm all the time. They've got more feathers on them. And they're bigger, so they're hungrier as well too. And so when they're older, say when they are 25 days old, 30, 35 days old, The female starts to do a little bit of hunting as well too, but she's more likely to sit closer to the nest, is what we understand. And the male is still doing the majority of the hunting, but the female is also helping out as well too. And then if one dies, so there's one document, a paper that observed female dying during the nesting season, and the male was not able to successfully fledge that nest. So they do have, I think he wasn't keeping up with feeding enough. I think maybe he was bringing enough food. I'd have to check the reference exactly. But it's not uncommon for nests, unfortunately, to fail if one of the adults were to die.
Sounds like it's a lot of work to feed all these little chicks, especially when they get hungry.
Yeah, that's right. And they can have 1 to even 6 young in a season, although the average is about 2 to 3, and in really good years 4 to 5. But 5 2-kilogram nestlings in a nest that's a lot of work. It sounds awful actually, but that's okay.
Wow. Well, that's all the questions that we have, and I think that's all the time that we have for today as well. So thank you again, Janet, for the awesome presentation and for all of your work with Ferruginous Hawks. Thank you so much for this fantastic presentation. Thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. When you leave this webinar, there will be a quick 1-minute questionnaire that'll pop up. And if you don't mind filling that out, that'll help us keep our webinars going into the future. Our funders like to see our results. So if you don't mind filling that out, that would be awesome. And just a reminder to check out the PCAP website for upcoming webinar presentations, like our Native Prairie Speaker Series and our Prairie's Got the Goods Week. Also, you're welcome to check out the PCAP YouTube channel, and a recording of this video will be going up in the near future, and we also have recordings of our past speaker series up there as well. So with that, thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks very much, Caitlin.
Bye.